All right, here I am once again talking about QYLD. This is a very divisive ETF. Some people love it and some people absolutely hate it, but regardless, it is the most popular buy right ETF. But the reason why I'm talking about it in this video is because QYLG is now a thing. This fund's inception date was September of 2020, so it's only about 9 months old, and this tries to address some of the shortcomings of QYLD. And in this video, I want to kind of compare them, see what's different, and see if it's a good investment. So let's read the key features. High income potential. QYLG seeks to generate income by writing covered calls on the underlying index. So that's still very similar to QYLD. It still has the same underlying index, the NASDAQ, and it uses covered calls just like QYLD. The upside potential, this is what's new. So by writing calls on 50% of the portfolio, the strategy allows investors to capture half the upside potential of the underlying index. And then lastly, QYLG expects to make distributions on a monthly basis. So that's nice, it helps with compounding. But this second bullet point is really the main difference. So it only writes those covered calls which limit your upside potential, but also give you that high dividend yield on half of the portfolio. Now just a little refresher on the OG. This one's talking about XYLD, but it's the same exact process, just a different underlying index. So this says the calls are sold monthly to generate that monthly income needed for the monthly payouts, and they are sold at the money. So this is how QYLD operates, and it says the reason for selling the call option with a strike price at the current trading price is to generate the highest amount of premium. However, this effectively means that all the gains of the underlying index are completely nullified. The only reason XYLD still has some underlying price appreciation is that some of the call premiums are reinvested in the fund, and there also might be minor gaps between the current trading price and the strike price of the call. This is a little visualization of what a call option is. On the y-axis, we got profit and loss, and visually we can see how a covered call caps and limits your upside potential. And in the case of QYLD, the strike price is right here. So you have absolutely no upside potential, but that generates you the highest premiums. And this is why QYLG tries to remedy this by only writing those covered calls on half of the portfolio. So the other half can still appreciate and has no upper cap on the price appreciation. Okay, so now to help decide if this ETF is any good, I have this little spectrum laid out, and I got two of them. So the first one is risk, and the second one is return. And I got the ETFs right here. So QYLG, it has a dividend yield right now between 5 and 6%, which is basically exactly half of QYLD. And I think you guys know why that's the case. Keep in mind, the data for QYLG is incomplete. It's only been out 9 months, so I can't make any definitive statements on it, so we will have to wait and see, but I'm just trying my best right now. Over the past year, or technically 9 months, it had price growth of 14.35%, and the total return since September is 30%. For comparison's sake, QYLD has a dividend yield of roughly 11%, and a capital growth of 6.2% over the past year. And since the inception of QYLG, the total return has been 21.45%. So when looking at the return spectrum, there's always that dance between maxing out on dividends, maxing out on capital growth, and all the options in between. QYLD, without a question, maxes out and goes all the way to the dividend side of the spectrum. And then on this side of the spectrum, we have something like VUG. This is a Vanguard growth ETF. It essentially has no dividend and is focusing on high growth companies. So that goes on this side of the spectrum. And then I also wanted to toss in JEPI just to have another point of comparison. So this is a high yield ETF, around 7.5% right now. Over the past year, it had a capital growth of 17% and a total return of 31.7% since the inception of QYLG back in September. JEPI is also a relatively new ETF, so the data is only about 1 year old, but it's going to be somewhere in the middle. That's kind of what it's designed to do, probably a little bit more towards the dividend side of the spectrum. And QYLG, with only having the in-the-money covered calls on half the portfolio, is clearly aiming to be also in the middle. So it's trying to find that sweet spot right in the middle by only writing covered calls on half of the index. And is that effective? I don't know. JEPI does a completely different strategy, and they're both pretty new, so only time is going to tell, but they're both trying to be in the middle. QYLD not only maxes out on the dividend side of the spectrum, but it also maxes out on the downside potential. And that's because if we come back to the covered call diagram, we can see QYLD, of course, is right here, so it has no upside potential, but you can see that it has unlimited downside potential. So when the market crashes, you're going to participate in all the downside, like what just happened with COVID. But then the thing is, usually after a market crash, there's usually a rebound, and with QYLD, you participate in all the downside, but none of the upside. And that's the main issue with QYLD. VUG, the growth ETF, this is like a full spectrum ETF. It has upside potential, it has downside potential, it can do anything. So I could put this in the middle. It's kind of a weird diagram for an ETF like this, but because it's high growth, I'm just gonna put it over here again. Now JEPI, in case you guys don't know about this ETF or haven't seen my previous video on it, it is 80% equities. So that means it's going to participate in 80% of the upside in the market, roughly speaking, of course. And unlike QYLD or QYLG, it doesn't have pure covered calls on the other 20% of the holdings. Instead, it uses equity-linked notes, which is a pretty complicated financial derivative, but essentially what you need to know is that they use that much like covered calls to generate a higher yield, but they also offer downside protection in a way that pure covered calls do not. Once again, JEPI doesn't have the longest track record, so it's hard to really backtest this and see exactly how good of a job it's doing. But on the risk spectrum, it's supposed to be in the middle, if not slightly more on the right side, because once again, 80% of it is just equities, so it has more upside potential. And then QYLG, once again, kind of like JEPI, it's trying to be in the middle, but it's going to be more on the left side of the middle, so kind of in this region. And this is because, much like QYLD, it still doesn't have any downside protection, but it does have half of the upside potential. So with all that said, is QYLG a good investment? Well, it's simply too early to tell. Once again, it's 9 months old, so it's so hard to really look at the numbers and compare it to other ETFs. But in comparison to QYLD, I would say as long as you don't need the highest yield possible, I would say it's definitely an improvement. You have still a high yield, 5 to 6%, but you have half of the upside potential. The downside is you still have no downside protection. So when the market crashes, you're going to go down with it 100% and only up with it 50%. I think an ETF like JEPI is definitely its biggest competition. And so far, once again, they're both very new ETFs, so it's hard to really compare to the data. But so far on the surface, I would say JEPI is my favorite. It has a higher dividend yield. It does have some downside potential, and being 80% equities, it does participate in more of the upside. But that's just how I see it. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.